Great. So just a little bit about this conversation series. The Bureau of Noncompetitive Research, which is myself and Victoria Stanton, are hosting a conversation series inviting scholars whose practices engage with facets of slow scholarship to discuss their research in context of the academy and how it might be applied to artistic processes within and outside the institution. So we're speaking to each person one at a time and on one significant element of their work. The format of this series favors slow and expansive approach, offering a generous space of collective reflection between our guests, ourselves, and the audience. The first event was held on September 29th via Zoom and featured the Bureau, myself, and Victoria in conversation with each other, contextualizing the series in its inception, and looking at the relationship between dialogue, collaboration, and cooperation, and how these processes necessitate taking more time and doing things more slowly. The second event was held on October 20th and featured the Bureau in conversation with Dr. Robert Luzar of Bath Spa University, speaking about the intersections of slowness, art making, and politics. And so both of those sessions are actually up on YouTube. So I am just going to put the links for them if anyone is interested in the chat. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the Department of Art Education at Concordia University and the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, who have generously helped us and supported us in this project.
And just before we introduce our guest for this evening, I have a little technical point to bring up with Stacey. Stacey, if you could pin our 3 screens for the recording, that'd be great.
I've already done it.
Okay, wonderful. I need to do it on my side. Thank you so much. And so, one moment as I get myself organized here. We're delighted to welcome Alanna Thain from McGill University, who's joining us this evening. This is a real honor and a real joy, as conversations have been ensuing around these topics for quite some time, and having the opportunity to really discussions on notions of rest and how these intersect with the institution. And I see that my internet connection is unstable, so I might have been frozen while I was speaking, so I'll keep going. It's such a pleasure to be able to have this opportunity. So I'll say a little bit about Alanna, who's based at McGill University here in Montreal. Alanna's research addresses questions of time, embodiment, and media across contemporary cinema, dance, and performance. Alanna is currently co-leading an interdisciplinary research creation experiment in the epistemologies and equities of sleep, organizing a series of sleep salons happening this fall through her New Frontiers and research-funded project, The Sociability of Sleep. And I will now hand it over to Alanna. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you so much, Victoria and Stacey, for this invitation, and everybody for being here tonight. I was able to come to the first one and had lots of great chats, and hope that continues tonight as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some of the practices in my work that this prompt inspired me to go back to. Some of them kind of took me by surprise where I ended up. And I'm also going to introduce this new project on sleep just to give some shape to the conversation that will then follow. As Victoria mentioned, I'm a film, media, and performance scholar, also working on gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. And in my career, I've taught in these areas at McGill, where I also direct something called the Moving Image Research Lab, which is devoted to the study of the body in moving image media and to research creation techniques. And I recently spent 4 years as director of the McGill Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. And from really early on in my PhD work, I situated my own research within practices of what I've come to call techniques of togetherness, thinking about how to create sites of assembly and participation that are inclusive and facilitating for bodies like my own, which have not always felt at home in the institution. And my model here is not hospitality, even though I think a lot of the practices overlap with what we might recognize as hospitable practices. Though I recognize all the ways in which there's often been a place for me in educational institutions that's more or less livable, which is not always the case for the collaborators, peers, and students that I value the most. Instead, I'd situate these practices as between housework and homework. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. And within this fraught institutional space, it's within this fraught institutional space that I want to talk about slowness today. And I'm just going to share my screen. I have a few slides to make it less boring. Let's see. Where did you go? I think that should work. Okay. So Bruno Latour says that the critic is the one who assembles, who provides arenas in which to gather. And I'm going to look at 3 examples of this kind of critical work that for me were attempts to find pragmatic responses to questions of burnout, exhaustion, and the ongoing crisis. I started at McGill in 2007, so right before the global financial crisis of 2008, that I know that were also the topic of conversation in the last event that you guys did in this series. And my work on rest is really rooted in feminist politics of care, but also is grounded in a fundamental contradiction that I haven't been able to resolve. And maybe we can also talk about this. On the one hand, how to care for time that's considered off time, or time that exists just to serve on time. So for example, coffee breaks at a conference. Coffee breaks is kind of fuel for the real work of attending or presenting research, where you might have high energy food that can be a bit rough on the body, caffeine, usually bad coffee, sugar, hits of energy so that you can keep going. This, though, is also time for socializing, for bio breaks, for a kind of time that I think we're all missing right now with these online formats, but that's also really devalued. In a lot of my projects that I've worked on over my career, I've thought about ways to bring a different quality to these parts of the encounter. So in 2013, I worked on a major research creation event at McGill called Time Forms, Temporalities of Aesthetic Experience with my colleagues Stephen McAdams and Eric Lewis. And your prompt really led me to go back to this event and think about work and the work of institutionality itself. For this event, we asked people to submit proposals not to present work, but to curate a kind of temporal experience from their research and from their practices, and to really attend to the speeds and slownesses that they would help to shape. As part of the work of that event, we thought a lot about interstitial spaces, so things like the conference coffee break. And like I said, these are usually outside of the real work, and they're about helping you get back to work. I wondered how else these kind of breaks could be and how we could understand them as a critical aspect of sustainable research. So fully part of the research, right? Not adjacent to it or outside of it. With a team of students and colleagues, I organized something called the Time Lab that over the course of the entire event activated these conference off hours, in particular around eating and resting. So this included experiences like a collaboration with this daytime rave organization called Lunchbeat in Montreal. We held a daytime rave in the basement of the music building at McGill. And in the artificial night of this concert hall at noon turned into a nightclub, the dark space brought a really different energy to eating and what it meant to be restored. So I think there's something about darkness that lent itself even in a kind of beautiful frenetic space of dancing that we're really missing right now, that produced a different quality of encounter. On another morning, we filled the sunny atrium of the music building with jars of sun tea that steeped all day until they were served in an afternoon reading session. And the slowness of the steep, we hoped, might register not just in the moment of drinking as kind of the end of the result, but in the memory of things like light through the glass, confounding the singular moment of paying attention with the richness of other rhythms. So in this way, slowness wasn't a singular quality, but a way to delay the collapse of the demands to be here now and to encourage temporal forms of wandering. What really happened with these small and even incidental encounters is that they came back as insights into desire, into what we want from these encounters. So a last example, the final event of time forms was a dinner party called the Long Meal, in which each dish had an elegantly composed time signature. One course was a kale salad, pictured here, which involved bringing out big bowls of kale to the table and asking volunteers to massage the kale into delicious edibility. One of the participants was a lovely rep from McGill's Sustainability Project Funds, who really understood what sustainability could be outside of, recycling boxes. And when she was massaging away, she suddenly broke into a beautiful rendition of Love Me Tender. And she kept singing to the kale until the song was done. So in the space of that song, she highlighted the critical connection between the tenderness of transformation and how it really pulls in multiple directions at once. It's the fabric of sociability itself that needs that kind of tending, which is a form of slowness itself. So in tending, I always hear the roots of attending. On the one hand, to care for, and on the other hand, attendre, or to wait. And I think there's something in the connection between those that I found interesting. These questions of care practices really took on a different quality in my job as director of the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, a place that for a lot of feminist researchers at McGill was a kind of home away from home within the institution. Food played a big role in all of our events because as feminist researchers, we understood that you have to facilitate means for participation. And we had a lot of roadblocks. We were housed in a physically inaccessible building. We weren't allowed by McGill's legal department to provide on-site childcare for many events, but the least we could do was feed people so that they could show up. At an event in 2016 called Circuits of Consumption, Arts, Activism, and the Biopolitics of Food Control, we started a day with a talk from the founder of Dispatch Coffee here in Montreal, who sourced and made the coffee we would drink all day, who talked about the challenges of running a coffee truck in Montreal and the relation of third wave coffee to gentrification. The entire day took place in the sensorially promiscuous ambience of the work of our keynote speaker, Lisa Myers, who cooked in Eastern Bloc's kitchen all morning. If you remember the old Eastern Bloc, it had an open kitchen that was open to the gallery space. She was cooking during the panels, and then she spoke of her own practice across food and place in her artwork as we ate her food. The leakiness of this encounter, the way that smells and sounds kind of traveled out from the kitchen and sent back things like rumbling tummies, distractions, and intensifications of the other offerings at hand. The way it wove qualities of anticipation and also satiety into the day's fabric to fray the edges of when one thing was happening taught me that slowness is an experience of leakiness as a contagious form of rhythm and a kind of soft edging. Slowness then is maybe more infiltrative than interruptive. We often associate slowness with simplification, but in my experience, it's exactly the opposite. Slowness brings more complexity, more heterogeneity, and more otherness to any encounter. It's a radical expansion of what happens in the happening that I would say is the basis for thinking about slowness as a practice of ethics. So work on food is fraught for a feminist in any institution where food is often associated with uncompensated, undervalued, and gendered expectations of labor. And it's for this reason that I situate the work institutionally between housework and homework. Homework, I think of in terms of the insights around socially reproductive labor identified by the Wages Against Housework movement of the 1970s. Who saw in the invisible and undervalued work of keeping the machine of capitalism running through cleaning, feeding, and servicing waged labor, a strongly gendered component. So for Silvia Federici, the cruelty of this form of labor, where the body is on the clock 24/7, is that it creates, quote, the impossibility to see where our work begins and ends, where our work ends and our desire begins. So I wanted to propose that we could think about slowness as a movement of desire. And I want to juxtapose this question of work and desire with another feminist thinker, Sarah Ahmed's own conflation of housework with homework when it comes to thinking about institutional forms of life. Ahmed writes in her book, Living a Feminist Life, I'm suggesting that feminism is homework because we have much to work out from not being at home in the world. In other words, homework is work on as well as at our homes. We do housework. Feminist housework does not simply clean and maintain a house. Feminist housework aims to transform the house to rebuild the master's residence. To become a feminist is to stay a student. This is why the figures of the feminist killjoy and the willful subject are studious. So I was interested in this because there's kind of two different models of time at work here. On the one hand, the kind of slow grind of endless labor that mutes our desires, makes everything the same, and the studiousness of a homework that's ever in the making. So the question that I have about slowness and institutionality is, what can bring a different rhythm to institutional reproduction to better align institutions with our desires? Ahmed offers as a thought about this, attention to breath. She says, I'm not saying that a desire for the ordinary does not take an institutional form, or that a zone of intimacy that covers the walls does not end up being an aspiration for a property, making things ours, so they cannot be taken away. There's more, though, in an aspiration not to be unhoused than an aspiration for a house. To aspire is to breathe. With breath comes imagination. With breath comes possibility. It's also from Living a Feminist Life. And so there's a tendency to everyday opportunities, the next breath. For example, that became very interesting to me. Breathing like eating is a quotidian rhythm at hand as a tool for altering unlivability. So in the last couple of years, I've looked to another intimate form of repetition and slowness, sleep, as a site for rethinking what it means to live together. So that's why, oops. Just skip ahead over that. A few years ago, I started working on queer and feminist sleep, in particular after rewatching Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho, where River Phoenix plays a narcoleptic sex worker trying to survive his extreme vulnerability. The film opens on an image that calls to mind Federici's Lament, this one in the upper, from the left corner. In this scene, Phoenix is getting a blowjob from a John, but it's almost impossible to tell at first if he's resting or if he's in ecstasy. Is this work or is this pleasure? And the film is full of these kind of confounded images that cluster around Phoenix at rest, usually on the job. Sleep looks like work, it looks like death, it looks like love. So I've started tracing these images in films that explore what I've come to call the labor of being a body in queer and feminist work. And in 2016, I met the Bangalore-based artist and street harassment activist Jasmine Pateja during a workshop at Ada X. Pateja started a project called Meet to Sleep as a response to the kind of embodied fear that she experienced as a woman walking alone in the streets. And she said that she'd long had a fantasy of sleeping in the day in broad daylight in a public park, but always felt constrained by the fear. So she started a project where she invited other people, women and gender nonconforming people, to meet in parks to sleep together in public. And she says that this gives us the right to be vulnerable, which for me has been a really important concept in thinking about sleep. It's really shaped what I've come to think of, in fact, as the sociability of sleep. And this is the name of a new project I launched this year with Alexandra Kaminska at the Université de Montréal and a really amazing team of artists, scientists, and media studies scholars. It's a 2-year research creation experiment in studying and designing for sleep as a more sociable form. And Alex and I really started from the observation that although sleep is often identified as a crisis, a social crisis, most of the solutions for poor sleep download responsibility onto individuals to become better managers of their sleep conditions. And so we want to understand where and how sleep is being understood and cared for instead as a social good, and what it might mean to sleep together. So in my work on sleep, one of the things that I keep encountering is the fact that everybody's an expert on sleep, right? Everybody has a story, everybody has a condition. I've struggled my whole life with night owl syndrome or delayed sleep onset against the idea that the early bird gets the worm. So even sleep becomes a competitive form in these kind of sayings. And I just wanted to introduce some of the thinking behind our project and how it might relate to thinking sleep as a form of extreme slowness. We really kind of start from the idea that sleep is more social than it might seem, and that it's a collective concern. And we're really interested in this idea of sleep sociability and how it might be rooted in vulnerability that requires more social forms of care. and to ask what are the other sociabilities of sleep besides a good worker or an obedient child, for example? How do we think about ideas like a sleeper subjectivity, the ways in which we navigate time, space, ourselves, and others in relation to questions of rest? And one of the things I'm really interested in is the difficulty of sleep as an object, that it might require what we're thinking of as epistemologies of obscurity that can straddle the gap between individual expertise. You can all tell how you slept last night, or we think we can, and the kind of external metrics and technologies and observers that are increasingly dominating and even displacing our own personal experiences of sleep. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. We're thinking about how sleep is a really difficult object of investigation. It has a kind of mysterious quality to it, but also how we might want to actually work with that quality rather than simply drag sleep into broad daylight, how we might respect the kind of rhythms that sleep imposes on questions of research. We're really thrilled that Victoria and Stacey are going to be participating and performing at a graduate research colloquium through the sociability of sleep in January. And also Jasmine Pateja, whose work I was mentioning earlier, is going to be participating in one of our sleep salons in the winter as well. And I'll share just the website, which we're still working on a bit, but where you can find more information about our activities. So we'd love to continue the conversation there.
Thank you for that thorough, very thought-provoking, interwoven introduction into this trajectory from 2013. That was the first series that you showed us, right? Up to the Sociability of Sleep series. So that's an excellent overview and really fleshes out already the conversation that we want to continue with you this evening, that is looking at those connections between rest, sleep, the institution, moments of care. One of the questions that we have that we want to look at with you, that we want to discuss with you, is this notion of what it would mean to be removing competition, if that's something that we could conceive of. So we're talking about both the financial component and a social component of competition. If removing this could possibly change research.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one I've been thinking about with a very specific focus more recently since the pandemic. I mean, I think attention to slowness and questions of care really asks that we be open to the idea of alter rhythms, right? That to me, slowness is always an opportunity for bringing more difference to any situation rather than homogenizing it. That slowness is not a single quality, but rather a kind of practice of tapping back into these multiplicities. So at its heart, I think slowness is a practice of difference, which to me works against models of competition, where there needs to be some kind of standard metric against which you can succeed and fail. And I think about that a lot, just in terms of daily rhythms of sleeping and rest, and who can get enough rest to be successful in this way. But it's also a way, I think, of moving away from the doctrine of discovery that's so dominant in research forms. I mean, it's really a way also of decolonizing research practices and more about tapping into what's already there. So when you slow down, I think one of the things that you see is that there's so much more going on than you think. And there's lots and lots of techniques for thinking about this and for tuning into these kinds of things. But it's always a surprise to take a moment, to take a breath, to try to rest, and then to just notice the richness of what's going on beyond the thing that's pulling our attention and putting those demands on our attention. So I think one of the things is just asking how can we activate our attention differently? How can we activate our perception differently? To come back to some of the questions we were talking about earlier around perception. Specifically though, in the context of the pandemic, one of the things that I've been working on a little bit in collaboration with lots of other people is the question of universal basic income. And partly that came about just because as a tenured professor whose job was not impacted, my salary was not impacted by the pandemic, And there are many people who didn't experience financial loss during the pandemic, but being surrounded by people who are engaged in more precarious forms of work, who were deeply impacted by the pandemic, and coping with that double anxiety of the pandemic, and then also the uncertainty about when and how they were able to get back to work or to pay their rent or any of those kinds of things. The question of universal basic income became really prominent. And there was a group of artists in Montreal, kind of spearheaded by a collective from Je suis Julio, who started a conversation around universal basic income from the point of view of artist workers, but I think with a kind of universal demand. But that conversation was really in line with conversations that were happening across Canada and indeed around the world. And so there were a number of manifestos that were produced coming out of artistic communities. And there's also been a number of new initiatives around universal basic income. Ireland, for example, just instituted a pilot project where I think something like 2,000 artists who are going to be drawn randomly will receive a universal basic income for a certain period of time. And so we had a lot of conversations in different contexts about what this would mean to how we worked, how we would organize our time, what we would do differently. And I think in some ways there was some informal experimentation with this, with something like the SIR, right? Where people were able to step out of their rhythms and find other ways of working. I have an article coming out that I co-wrote with Dana McLeod, looking at queer and feminist film festivals during the pandemic, and how these kind of organizations that are often very precarious and have very few resources coped with the loss of their opportunity to assemble. And to a person, they all talked about what the pandemic made possible, not just what it took off the table. So one thing though that the conversations really brought up for me is thinking about, well, what would UBI do to university and to the academic institution if that became possible? And I know that there's some informal conversations happening about this, but I'd be curious to know what that would do for forms of precarity in the institution. I thought about this first through art labor, as so many artists in Montreal also work as sessional lecturers in the university system, again, in a very precarious way, in a way that might give them flexibility in their art practice, but that doesn't give them a lot of long-term security, even if they work at an institution for years and years and years. But that's the same in gender studies and feminist studies, for example. A lot of core courses in topics that are research intensive, that are changing very quickly at McGill, are taught by sessional workers, not even faculty lecturers, but people who are hired to teach one course, who are kind of dropped into the institution, expected to be au courant with all the latest research, and then paid in a way that doesn't reflect what they're getting out of it. And so I just kind of wondered, what would the university look like if there was universal basic income, where people could step in and out of rhythms of teaching and knowledge exchange, not based on the kind of rat race of academic competition, but rather different rhythms of research, different rhythms of engagement. What would that look like? And how would it change forms of gatekeeping in the academy? How would it change forms of competition in the academy? To know that you could do your work regardless of whether you were competitive for a grant or for a handful of tenure track positions. It's just a question that I have, but because I know that so many artists are also working as teachers, I just wondered about that relation between art labor and teaching labor, and what something like universal basic income might do to support and provide space for that kind of work.
Alanna, how would you imagine that the university would step up or get on board in order to support that? Because on the one side, we have government providing the universal basic income, and on the other side, we have the university that has its system of seniority. And stepping away from that means that someone else steps in and then gets those seniority credits that you're not getting when you're not teaching. So you have an income that's coming in potentially through the universal basic income, but then how does the university support that initiative? Or have you been in these conversations you're having, starting to have, thinking about, again, this might be a utopian vision we're talking about, but has that come up in any way? Or what texture does that have? What shape can that take? Or do you have anything to say to that question?
Yeah, the pragmatics are, I think I have not been in those conversations. It's something that I'm just starting to work on and work with and to think about. You know, we've seen a lot of talk about universal basic income in relation to artists, in relation to people whose jobs are at risk because of things like automation, for example. But I wonder how we would think about it in relation to these other forms of knowledge work. And I think it comes down a lot to the question of value. But I think we could also bring other forms of complicated temporal relations to work to bear on this question. So, you know, the other thing we've seen in the pandemic is that women have dropped out of the workforce en masse because the care work that they were already doing that could sometimes be supplemented by other people, not just childcare, but also elder care, for example, has been overwhelming. And it's, you know, it's a real question about whether and how people will be able to return to the workforce in this way. But that happens in academia as well. You know, the kind of pressures, the disjunct between, you know, biological rhythms and the pressures of academy just don't work for many women. And so we often see like a lack of women in senior leadership roles, partly because of choices or lack of choices about how to stay engaged, how to stay involved in the university. So there's ways in which we could take earlier lessons about altered rhythms of labor from things like the Wages Against Housework movement, from things like earlier experiments in universal basic income, the famous example of Mincome, which was an experiment in the 1970s in Manitoba, in a small Manitoba town where everybody was given a basic income. One of the things that they found is that the only two groups who did less waged labor were male high school students who didn't drop out of high school, who stayed and completed their education because they weren't required to go out to get a job to help the family, and then women with small children at a time where there was no parental leave, who were able to stay home and do childcare and then find their way back into the system. So that question of how do we shift the rhythms of engagement and how do we normalize perhaps rhythms of stepping in and stepping out instead of this kind of competitive one size fits all model of what constitutes success or what constitutes a career trajectory. They seem like the kind of questions that we could at least start asking from this point of view.
Even just what, like from an academic standpoint, or even from an artistic standpoint, what experiments, what kind of depth you could go into a project if you didn't have to rely on grants. Right. So like whether we'd like to admit it or not, our ideas are shaped by the fact that a jury of our peers are going to assess our ideas and give us money based on them. So, which is a good thing and a bad thing, can be good or bad. But it certainly shapes the type of research that happens. And I think it excludes some research that could be really important, that isn't sexy or of the time, or is newer forms of research, maybe like research creation is now kind of has its own streams of funding, but prior to quite recently it didn't. So that's not
a great point. And I would say the one other example in the university where maybe there's been some thinking relevant to these kind of questions is also about grants. So in Canada, if you're a tenured professor, it's an expectation that you'll write grants, and a lot of your grant writing is to get funding for your students. Well, what if we just gave the money directly to students? If you get into grad school, you get money. And, you know, there's just cut out the middleman and free up people's time to actually do the research and to do the work, rather than create these kind of bureaucratic systems of gatekeeping that, again, like really determine what kind of research gets done. I was in Europe a few years ago where they've gone to this model of mega grants. So all the researchers in Europe, it's really this increasingly two-tier system where some people get these mega grants, they're completely released from teaching, and others basically just teach and work all the time. And I was at a feminist center, and they were saying, you know, we got one of these mega grants, but we went back to the organization and we said, you know, we want to give it back. And we think that everybody should just get the same amount of money, or there should be some sort of minimum income in terms of grants for people, because it's actually a much more feminist way to approach research. and try to make sure that we have a diversity of voices in research as well.
Did that happen? Did they actually?
It's just gone even crazier. The grants are so enormous and so so ridiculous, and the disparity between the value we assign to teaching and the value we assign to research is just a gap that continues to grow.
Yeah, I know Victoria and I have talked about kind of, we looked at a book called The Slow Professor and talking about like the joys of teaching and the like importance needs to be placed back on teaching. And I think in some ways, like artistic practice is kind of a similar thing, that it's like undervalued in many ways. And so we end up spending time writing for publication rather than artistic practice, even though in theory an exhibition counts on our CV, but how do we count things and how do we value things? And I think thinking about those ideas is really interesting and a way of starting to shift things within the institution.
And as Stacey and I have spoken of to each other, and then in the context of the previous conversations, in particular the first one, when we introduced the series, we're aware of the fact that we're not necessarily proposing these concrete solutions or something that already exists, but in more so creating a form or wanting to contribute to creating a space in which these conversations are at least taking place as various entry points that hopefully evolve and continue to create a larger and larger network of people, both in our local communities and then extending that beyond. And again, Zoom allows this possibility to continue having these conversations so that we're not only in these isolated pockets of what this world or what this circumstance could look like, but how do we actually start to articulate that to ourselves and to each other, and how can we learn it? Speaking for myself, it's also a question of finding language to articulate what these processes are, why they're important, what these values are, why they're important, how we start integrating, instigating, and then integrating. And so again, it's also why we really appreciate having conversations with people such as yourself, Alanna, who've been thinking about these issues for a number of years and finding language for and creating and building community around and accompanying it as shifts keep happening. The context of the pandemic, I imagine, is very different, was different for you to be thinking about this versus the context, in 2013. So, those particular evolving situations are also contributing to how we're shifting perspective and language around what are the needs and how can we start and keep having these conversations.
I think the question of how to find language is a really interesting one, and maybe I'll get the link and share it with you. One of the things that I did during the pandemic was work with a collective called To Gather Apart, where we were doing these exquisite corpse videos every 2 weeks, just sending out an open call with a theme, and people would submit a second. We'd redistribute those. People would make a 19-second video on a theme. We put them together and have screenings and then a conversation. And we did one on universal basic income. We called it Income Realness. And I was rewatching it earlier today, and it was really interesting to me to see how people responded to that question. We had, I think, one of the best discussions, post-screening discussions, just thinking about this question that was really urgent and impactful for a lot of people, thinking how they were going to survive, but also thinking about, well, what difference did something like CERB make? For a lot of people, that was not just a lifesaver, but exactly, it provided a moment to rethink a little bit some of the practices they've been engaging in. So I would just say to take a look at it. There's some great 19-second clips in there, but it's very interesting to feel the different rhythms and to feel the different possibilities. What do people attend to with that as a kind of prompt for thought?
And you're welcome to share the link in the chat box.
Yeah,
while we're here. I don't know if Stacey, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We also talked about about kind of this idea of slowness in the institution as a kind of a heel dragging of the institution, and how do we counteract that type of slowness as a kind of a more conservative idea. And we haven't really discussed this. We have looked at slowness as kind of a way of reframing things and thinking about change, but can slowness be a conservative idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that has to do with a form of slowness that is about a kind of homogeneity. And so they think there is a kind of valorization of slowness that can lend itself to conservative ends. And I will say that when I'm thinking about this as a question of institutionality, I think about the lack of change within the institution. You know, as a feminist scholar working in a rather traditional institution that's very conservative, change is slow to come. And what I've seen at McGill is a kind of dynamic of both incredible slowness institutionally and then a crisis mentality, where crisis provokes reactivity, but not necessarily long-term and sustainable change. And so it's been, I think, sometimes frustrating to work in that environment. I would say particularly working in a field like gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, where it's a vibrant field, it's super lively, and it's very intimately connected to what's going on all around us all the time. And then trying to articulate the value of that in an institution that is not able to respond on the fly or doesn't want to respond on the fly can be a huge problem. And again, like institutionally, I will just give you an example that was a source of frustration for me, is that at the institute where I teach, you know, that institute's been around for more than 30 years at this point, and maybe 40 actually, no, 30, I can't really do math. I'm a media studies scholar. But it now has the equivalent of one tenured professor after 30 years in existence. So that really tells you how the university values that work. We have faculty lecturers who've been teaching there for years, who don't then make their way into tenured positions with job security. And so that's also a way of stalling the advance of a discipline like that, which I think has quite transformative effects into the institution as a whole. So yeah, the institution slowness, I don't ever want to valorize slowness in and of itself or fetishize slowness, because so often it's a source of frustration. And I really recommend Sarah Ahmed's work on this matter. She's a feminist scholar who left her position at Goldsmiths University because of the brick wall that she faced working around student complaints of sexual harassment and sexual violence within the institution, where there was no response and there was no change. There was only a status quo. And she's written very movingly and convincingly about the phenomenology of institutional slowness and how destructive that is to bodies trying to survive in those spaces.
I guess
it's also a very lively book.
I guess I have a follow-up connected question is then how do you practice care within those environments with your colleagues, with your collaborators, and how does care kind of connect with those practices within kind of a, I don't know if hostile is the right word, but within an unwelcoming institution?
Also a great question. I think it's one of the reasons why I said something like IGSF is a home away from home for a lot of people, which is often how it was described, as a kind of refuge space, and why these domestic practices like feeding the people who came there, we always had coffee on, were important. They weren't just frivolous whims, or they weren't just decor, that they were actually really foundational to the way that we wanted to work. You could always get, you know, a piece of chocolate and a cup of coffee if you came to the Institute. And that's kind of important. I think though, it's a question for me, and that's also why I started with this question of, to what extent do developing these care practices within the institution serve then to reproduce the institution itself, making these kind of margins of livability, these margins of what feel like pockets of breath, but actually allowing the institution to go on as is. So I actually don't know, and I don't have a good answer for that. I feel deeply committed to institutionality and education. As a first generation university student, I feel like my education has opened so many doors in my life. And I think that there's something incredibly valuable about that as an exposure to difference. But yeah, it's also a very unlivable space. It causes people to burn out a lot. It causes people to leave a lot, and it causes people to check out a lot as well in ways that I completely understand. So, you know, one care practice is actually letting people go and letting people, knowing that it's okay, not forcing people to conform to just the sort of one size fits all model of the institution. But if you're working in this institution, you're finding any comfort there, I think it's also your obligation to work to try to make it a more capacious space. But yeah, the question of where is it worth putting your energy and your time is a real one. And I don't have a good answer for that.
It also has to be thinking about the very real and quotidian challenges of being a classroom instructor, of having to provide a structure, a curriculum that is meant to respect a time frame, that's wanting students. I come at this from an artistic context, so we're talking studio classes, which might look very different from seminar classes, say in political science, but putting those curriculum into place and wanting to respect the timelines and also wanting to provide a spaciousness for the students, striking that balance is a real challenge, an ongoing challenge, especially coming from a perspective and ideology philosophy around wanting to slow down, not in the fetishized sense, but in the sense of a care practice. So this is an ongoing challenge that I and my colleagues with whom that I have these conversations, and that's actually very few and far between. We don't have that many conversations about this because it's a bit contentious and it's a bit taboo still in some ways. But that's a reality also, and a very tricky, slippery space of how to be a good instructor that's caring with, accompanying in that place of spaciousness where we're in this bind, this double bind. So that's this part of the conversation has me thinking about that, how we show up as instructors from this place of care.
I mean, also, how do we, like, for me at least, how do we practice care while having boundaries within that as well, right? Like, how do we practice care for our students without creating burnout for ourselves? How do we create space for them that's flexible without it affecting us as well, like in a kind of like put on your own oxygen mask before you help someone else sort of way. And obviously I don't have the answer to any of this, but
and same, it's more so the saying it, realizing, wow, I'm not having this conversation enough. What does it mean to start having this, or have this be part of that larger conversation? What does it mean in a public context like this, in a public forum, to be addressing these questions, which don't necessarily have solutions, but at least naming, coming back to this notion of finding language for, building community for and upon.
I think that's why, even though I was a bit shy to be like, I'm going to talk about curating a coffee break at a conference, like one of the things that those things do is they're spaces of gossip, they're spaces of exchange. And I feel like we don't have enough formal spaces for exactly those kind of knowledge sharing opportunities that aren't formalized in relation to our so-called real work. And that can include things like teaching. But I think one of the things that the pandemic has done is it's really brought those questions to the fore, and it's made people really think about their pedagogical practice. And now that there is this kind of demand to go back as if nothing has happened, which is not to say that, you know, most of my colleagues are, I'm not teaching this semester, but most of my colleagues are thrilled to be back in the classroom. They're so happy to be back with our students. We all miss them so much, and we miss those kind of encounters. But there is a way in which, like, we act as if nothing has happened. And everybody is experiencing a tremendous amount of burnout right now. So it's also, what would it take to be able to acknowledge the aftermath? Not even the aftermath for many people, as we're still very much in it, but just the impact of what we've been going through for the last year and a half, but how for many people that kind of crisis actually was nothing new. So I think that's kind of the challenge of the question of slowness, is to resist the being over and done with certain things, but then to take this kind of longer perspective and understand how the crisis was already active for so many people, even before the pandemic began, and to think about, well, what do we want? What do we desire from our practices? What do we desire from our institutions? What do we desire from our encounters? And try to find the spaces that allow us to feel what that might be outside of the rhythm of competition.
Well, on that note, that could be a really good place to segue into some of the comments that have come up in the chat, if you're both amenable, Stacey and Alanna. I see Rose had written, not sure if this subject has been tackled in the last session, was wondering if you could talk a bit about cyclical relation to work in our practices, taking breaks and normalize alter rhythms, speaking of. And I don't know if either of you would like to speak to that, Alanna or Stacey.
I mean, I'll just say I'm on sabbatical right now, which is not feeling quite like sabbatical yet, but I feel like everybody should have a sabbatical in every form of job. Whatever you choose to do with your life, you should always have an opportunity to step out of the normal rhythm of how you do it. So even if I'm struggling a bit with, it's not like it's not time off, it's not a holiday, it's not even really a break quite yet, but it is a change from the normal ways in which my time is organized. And it does give you that chance to do two things. One is, again, to think about what do you want, and to try to feel it in your body. What are you responding to? What lights your fire? What do you wish you never had to do again? And the other thing is, I think, to step out of the fantasy of busyness and the self-importance that accrues to the culture of busyness in our society, and to know that most things will not fall apart if you step away from them. And I think that's one of the ways in which the culture of busyness in the academy, at least, tends to function, is this idea of irreplaceability. And in some ways, the sabbatical shows that, in a good way, everybody is replaceable. And in fact, all work is collective work, that there is nothing that we do that is not indebted to every single person around us and to everyone who came before us. So there's something nice about those kind of alter rhythms as well, and periodic breaks, those punctuations of time that just allow us to feel what a different rhythm might be like. So universal basic income plus sabbatical, I think, would be a really great way to organize work from now on, if we're going to be utopian.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead, Stacey.
I was going to say, I have before I came back to school, I had like a very, I think, ideal in some ways for an artist that I did contract work for nonprofits mostly, and then had time to work on my practice in theory. But there's a precarity around that sort of work that like makes you feel like you have to, it's like, oh, someone's offering me a contract, I should take it regardless of like what's going on. And I think you get into that thinking, oh, well, it's good, I'll do a contract and I'll have some time to work. But what happens in reality is that you have a contract and then it's over, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to do some artwork. But now I'm also very stressed about not having any contracts and not having any income. And I think this is like something that a lot of people have been feeling with COVID in general, but something that is maybe something that many artists have been dealing with for a very long time. And this idea of balance is hard. I mean, it's a challenge. Basic income would be I think a huge help, and I think it would also be a huge help for sessional instructors who also are very kind of in similar situations, regardless of whether they're artists or otherwise researchers. So yeah, I mean, those rhythms, it's hard to be creative or do research when you're concerned about money and resources, I think. I don't know if that answered your question at all or your thought.
Or if you'd like to add anything to that. That was Rose who put that comment. Yusha asks, would you please elaborate on what you mean by fetishized slowness? Also, do you know any resources exploring the relationship between slowness and neurodiversity in academia?
I think by fetishized slowness, I'm thinking of things like the kind of glamour of the slow food movement, for example. You know, it's always sun-drenched and everybody has a lot of free time, but we don't ask the questions of where that free time comes from, or what subtends it, or the labor that makes leisure possible. So I think that's just what I mean by not fetishizing slowness as inherently a positive thing. There are lots of ways to activate forms of slowness that I think do this incredible work of attending to difference, attending to forms of care. But slowness in and of itself, as you know, the example of institutional slowness, for instance, or forms of leisure that rely on other people doing the labor, it's just a huge problem. And I think, again, the pandemic brought it out. We saw again and again this discourse, oh, the world has slowed down. But for many people, it didn't. It's sped up, whether they were taking on new forms of care work or whether just their daily rhythms were uninterrupted by the pandemic, or aggravated by lack of other forms of support during the pandemic. I mean, you could spend your whole pandemic baking sourdough bread, or you might just not have had that kind of free time. So that's just all that I mean by fetishized slowness. On slowness and neurodiversity, not explicitly. I mean, I would think that I'm wondering about. I'd need to think about that and see if I could come up with some actual resources that were specific to that. But I think one of the things that neurodiversity really speaks back to is the point that Victoria was bringing up earlier about the problem of fitting into these time forms, like say a 13-week semester, as the container within which you can produce a certain kind of work, and how that just doesn't work for lots of people. That we might need other kinds of rhythms. We might need other kinds of temporal organizations that can accommodate more diverse forms of experience.
I'd add to that, it's not specifically to academia, although academia is related to it. There is a book by a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist based in Chicago, called Smart But Stuck. I could put the title in the chat box here. It's Myrna Orenstein. I hope I'm going to get the spelling of it right. But if you Google Smart But Stuck, and so that is a book that looks at Myrna's experiences in the therapy context with clients and case studies, and in conversation with other professionals, experts, in particular for people with undiagnosed learning disabilities. But it does touch on the rhythms that are imposed, the capacity for our resilience, whether we know we are dealing with undiagnosed learning disability or whether it has been diagnosed, and how we can create the rhythm or be in rhythm with our rhythm to then show up to the rhythms that are imposed externally. I don't know if that's the best summary that I could give in a really small capsule, but it is definitely a resource that does, I would put that in the category of resources that might not be specific to that question, but that could be one. There's another book that I just came across that hasn't actually come out yet. Laziness Does Not Exist. It's by Dr. Devin Price, who I believe is neurodivergent and is writing from the perspective of neurodivergence, not specific again to the academy, but to this notion of how we show up to responsibility and what it means to be in a rhythm that doesn't necessarily align with the dominant rhythm of the rhythm of the dominant culture. I'll put the title of that in here as well. And I think there's another comment, Stacey, if you want
Yeah,
to.
I can read it.
Sure.
So you mentioned slowness is fundamentally incompatible with competitivity and therefore eliding the win-lose problem. Can you talk more about the problem of metrics inside of slowness inside the institution, both inside the classroom and for things like tenure and promotion?
I mean, in terms of tenure and promotion, at McGill, you go up for tenure after 5 years. And there's all kinds of rules about what counts and what doesn't count. Whether work that you've done before you arrive at the institution counts towards tenure. Sometimes the rules change. But what it means is that as a new professor, often freshly out of grad school, usually at your first job, almost always where you've moved to a new city, where you don't know people. In Quebec at McGill, because a lot of people who come don't necessarily speak French when they arrive, they're also trying to learn a new language so that they can get their permanent residency and their citizenship. So it's like you have to do everything in the first 5 years in order to keep your job. And it makes absolutely no sense. It's also a time when for a lot of people, because it's their first opportunity to have any kind of financial security, because you're a student for so long, you never have any money. It's also an opportunity to say, start a family. So there's a lot that happens in the space of this extremely compressed time period that doesn't actually make sense. It doesn't make sense that you have to jump through all of these hoops at that point. And there's actually been studies that show that many academics have a depression after tenure. And I think it's because it's very difficult to reorient your temporal rhythms to the what next of the kind of sense of what are the important markers of moving through my career. So that question of like, what else could that look like? What else could the movement through the academy look like? What else could these different temporal markers that take you from one phase of your career to another look like? It's something that we don't have a lot of good models for, but instead there's a lot of crush at the beginning and a lot of rush at the beginning that I don't necessarily think serves people very well. Young colleagues experience a lot of burnout in that time. And even though you might have a sabbatical at the end of 7 years, a sabbatical shouldn't just be a chance to recover, like it's a bit of a weird model that you just burn yourself out and then you use the summer or Christmas break or whatever to just try to get back on your feet. What if we had a life where people didn't need to experience burnout first before they had the right to rest? So thinking about what that could look like, it might extend some of those things. What if tenure came after 10 years or 15 years? Or what if we rethought the question of tenure so that it wasn't so bound to the only form of job security that most people in academia will ever know?
So this notion of integrating recovery into a work rhythm that doesn't happen, like you were saying, Alanna, at the point where we've already hit the wall. Yeah. But that's integrated such that we're far from that wall hitting to be able to keep being in a healthy rhythm that keeps us rejuvenated, invigorated.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Stacey. Yeah.
I mean, university or the way that we approach education is like that too. We're in school for 21 to 30-ish years, depending on how long we want to go. And then we just like never learn anything in a formal way again. We just go on with our career rather than integrating learning throughout like the entire life process. I was reading a book that recently was really encouraging apprenticeship, like work within like a work system. So that like you have a mentor system and so that this like kind of learning is formalized in some ways throughout your career and process. And I thought that was also a really interesting thought. I mean, you'd have to essentially change everything about the current education system to make it work, but it was sort of an interesting and then that also makes it less competitive, right? You have a mentor who you're learning from while you're doing things within your job rather than like reading and examinations and things like that as much.
I think about it was like a meme that was going around, and I think it was really kind of in art circles, but it's like, if you don't have a mentor who's, 10, 15 years younger than you, you're not doing it right. And I often think about my students as kind of mentors. And I don't know if it's specific to the fields that I teach in, like gender and sexuality studies, which again, evolving quickly all the time, but also cultural studies is my other main field, right? So also evolving all the time too. I mean, I haven't been teaching for a couple of years, so I don't know anything about TikTok, right? So I do understand my students as mentors in a certain kind of way, right? I can't make the same demands of them that I might make from a more traditional form of mentorship, but they're providing me with these kind of openings where I see the limits of my own knowledge. I feel very strongly the limits of my own experience, and I need to do more work. And try to think about, well, what does that actually look like in practice? Like, what if we had sabbaticals, like pedagogical sabbaticals as well, not just in the sense of preparing new courses, but thinking about, well, what are the gaps in my knowledge that I need to teach myself? I think part of institutional slowness is the fear that many people fear faced with changes, demands for change, and their own ignorance in relation to those change. It can make people very reactive. And so what if we just understood that we were constantly going to be going back to the well, that we might need to build in lifetime training in a way that was useful for our experience. Again, we've seen this missed opportunity with the pandemic, where suddenly everyone became an online instructor, right? Everyone had to learn new technologies, new formats, new ways of engaging our students. Everyone I know went to so many seminars trying to learn how to make that a good experience for their students, even though we recognize it wasn't the same thing as actual online learning. And yet, where is all of that knowledge kind of going? What would it mean to then step back and think, well, what do we do with all of this, including things like adapting our classroom to be more accessible for students for whom online learning was a really good experience because it suited where they were at and their resources.
There's a couple more thoughts in the chat box. And I would like to propose that we reserve, starting imminently, a bit of time for a prompt that Alanna had offered collectively. We could see if we want to do it as a bigger group or if we want to do that in a breakout room context. But I just want to address, Kelsey came back with another remark about slowness as it relates to course outcomes and the bounds of a semester. Should we try to tackle that in a brief way in response and then move to the collective, potentially collective somatic experience non-action? What do you say, Alanna and Stacey? It's about 8:15 now, and we're going to wrap up the session at 8:30.
I mean, it's hard because there are, I think trying to work in some flexibility, there's only so much flexibility that is available from the institution within that. But I know especially this semester, like we talked about how many projects, I prepared kind of a course outline, but it's like, how many projects do you think is actually reasonable for us to do together, where we can spend enough time with each one? We actually took a project out and extended 2 other ones. And so, there is space to do less. And I think we all kind of we're all programmed by whatever happened in our own undergrad. We default to that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is what we have to do to show that we have expertise or to show that we have knowledge of a subject.
In the space-time of the pandemic in particular, I'll put it this way, having had the opportunity to teach during the pandemic, one of the immediate things that became apparent was this shifting of rhythm that happened very, very quickly, particularly when the pandemic first started and lockdown first began and we were suddenly online. And that extended into the next semester, which would have been now last September, which was that, again, in the context of an art studio class, so I can't speak to another kind of discipline or field, but it gave us the opportunity to think about working differently, or I proposed in the class context to be thinking about work from a more process-based approach versus orienting toward a deliverable or what would be a kind of polished, tied up package of a project at the end. And that I found created a space for thinking through without a pressure to have to come to a conclusion. I understand that our class is meant to be a place where we do also learn how to finish something for exhibition, but I realized, well, you know, there's a lot of courses being offered, and students in this group, these young artists in this group, will have opportunity to finish projects in other classes. In this class, if they don't want to finish, but want to be in a process and share fragments of process as project, as the work, somehow that seemed to create a space. It opened up more space to not, yes, there were deadlines, but the deadlines weren't finished work shown by this date. It was show me what you've got by this date. And so suddenly that shifted a relationship to rhythm and making and thinking. So that's just I guess in a sense, a concrete example or possible example. I'm not saying it was a perfect class by any means, but this was a thing that we experimented together. So there was room for a desire to experiment together, to think about time differently.
Yeah, I think I really take Stacey's point about there's space to do less. One of the things that I experienced teaching in the pandemic is like students wanted structure as well, though. So they didn't want something that was just n'importe quoi, but this sense of like a deadline is show me what you've got now, I think is a really great way to respond to that kind of thing. And so thinking about what kind of constraints are labeling and what kind of constraints are just terrifying and deadening in that respect. But a lot of that also depends, you know, again, if you're a sessional instructor working on contract and you're only paid until, you know, December 31st or May 1st, you're just in a different ability to be flexible. Otherwise, it's really, you know, it's eating into your own resources, even if that's what you want to do. So that's something that I'm not sure students always know where their professors are coming from. If their professor is a tenured professor, or if they're being paid by the course, or if they're being paid just for a year, if they're a student, and those kinds of things matter. It's almost like we need some kind of transparency around those kinds of things, with the understanding that that impacts the kind of experience that you have in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, this is unrelated, but, or sort of related, set up my first projects as experiments. So telling them, it's like, this is kind of what, it's also a studio class. So this is the media I want you to use. This is kind of the concept generally that I want us all to think about, but it's an experiment. So it doesn't need to be like, there is one project that needs to be like finished. The other ones can be like, I need to see something, but like, it doesn't necessarily have to be ready for exhibition. Like, and giving this idea that like, you could take on a project that's like maybe too much and just not finish it. Or you could take on a smaller project and make it really polished, depending on how you want to kind of work. But yes, I'm mindful of time, so we should maybe consider
the prompt that Alanna had shared with us, and how we want to consider it. The prompt is, how can rest be collective and shared?